which was the news side. And one of the first things that you kind of figure out when you're covering companies is that pretty much the workers, especially if they're unionized, and short sellers are going to be your best sources. And I point that out because those are two constituencies that share a lot, the same thing in common with, people who want to socialize healthcare, education, religion, climate change, industrial policy. Any critique of capitalism is going to involve, coming up against people who say there's no incentive or motivation or accountability. All of those things, unions, public health, short sellers even, and regulators, environment, all of those things concern the long term. And people who have an interest in them are motivated to care about the long term. So one of the things that you realize at the journal, in any financial journalism job, is that management has zero. I mean, they'd have zero incentive to care about anything involving the long term at all. So the idea that, Warren Buffett kind of sort of single-handedly managed to allow the market capitalists and management to usurp the kind of monopoly on the long term. Like, maybe Warren Buffett will, watch out for your wealth for the long term, but nobody else gives a shit. This is sort of a kind of central conflict that I kept running into. How did wealth, the governors of our wealth, how did they sort of seize that? And how can we seize it back? Because we're actually the ones who care. To that end, when I joined, it was briefly after Glass-Steagall was repealed. Of course, the Wall Street Journal wrote an incredibly laudatory editorial at the time about, how this idiotic piece of legislation was finally being shattered. Well, the one thing that you can say for the market is it changes its mind pretty quickly. So a little over the summer they wrote this pro-Volcker, anti-too big to fail editorial that basically all but said bring back Glass-Steagall. That took 10 years to change, but it's still relatively quickly. So while we have this this chance, I just wanted to ask you guys how you think maybe we can sort of reclaim our rightful public, our rightful moral authority in the public eye when it comes to worrying about the long-term, consequences of stuff for the economy.
I think we should first put that question to the contract employee of the Wall Street Journal.
Hey, Mo, I am trying, okay? Every week we try to, I'm doing my best. Look, you mentioned something this is nobody's going to be happy when the polar ice caps melt and the coastline is inundated and all. We're looking at disaster, but it is going to prove one thing forever, and that is, this will be the greatest market failure of all time. And that's one of the reasons why there's several ideas out there that the right, the conservatives cannot accept. Because it strikes at the very core of what they believe, and one of them is climate change, because it would be the greatest market failure of all time. It would would indicate that all of these people grabbing for their self-interest, short-term self-interest, blah blah blah, doing the Ayn Rand thing. Look what they did. It took them centuries, and look what they goddamn did. Right. The other one, and you've probably noticed this, is that they cannot. That the conservatives cannot, with a few exceptions here and there, they cannot get their heads around what actually went on in the financial collapse. They can't talk about credit default swaps. They can't talk about what happened at the credit rating agencies. They can't talk. They have to blame everything because that's market failure. That means that the markets aren't omniscient and the markets don't figure everything out. And
they also just don't understand it.
They understand it. Come on, they're the ones that were making money off of it. You know this.
But conservative politicians really just can't fucking get their heads around it at all.
But they have to. So they have to put the blame on the people that took out the mortgages, on the Community Reinvestment Act. It's just this doesn't have anything to do with what we came here to talk about tonight. So I'm shutting up now. But okay, somebody else. I tossed this hot potato to someone.
Yeah, Kim.
Yeah, it's Acorn's fault.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Well, yes. By all means, let's get the mic to the man behind the pillar.
All right.
Yes. Now I look around. I taught at this school for 21 years, and I don't need that. I taught economics, politics, and some philosophy for 21 years. Truth is, in the last few years, I haven't been given any course because I specialize on China. Now, I look around, and I would say that looking at all the faces put together, that the maturity of the audience goes before 1970 as a notable point of a political change in our country because the multinationals took over the government, that many of you never did experience what a strong labor movement meant. And the reason is that they destroyed all of the laws that protected labor. Labor won in the Depression in the 1930s. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt used to say, when he was asked some questions, take it up with Sidney. Sidney Hillman was the head of the labor movement. That's how close the government was to solving the problems of people who work. Now, I'm telling you this because the sense that I have in this room, listening carefully, I'm not going against anything that's being said, because it's very highly intellectual, very highly cultured, but very little in struggle. Now, the difference between the labor movement and the ideology that is involved is that they have to fight for the right to organize. We shouldn't have to go around finding out who didn't get paid and then try to get them to get paid. There are laws, there were laws. These laws have all been turned around. And from 1970 on, they were destroying the labor unions in this country, and they did something else. They shipped out many of the industries that have labor movements in them in different parts of the world. So there's a whole political question that has not been raised in this particular discussion. Now, I'll give you an example.
Okay, one example, and then.
I'll give you one more minute.
Okay.
I deserve it.
Now you do.
I'll give you an example. There are three kinds of approaches to the labor movement. The one in Europe, where they have parties, but because they have more democracy than we have. And that democracy is expressed through parties that represent different sections of the population, and in particular, labor. That's why they're moving ahead in many of their places under the difficult circumstances now. Number two, we have the United States, which has practically destroyed the strong labor movement. And number three is something very new. The Chinese were fiddling around. They didn't know what they were doing until 2005, believe it or not. They didn't know anything about economics. They began to learn it. What happened in 2005? The party began to change because the people didn't like them. And the first thing that they did, in 2005, July, they passed a law that would protect the private property and private ownership of the big corporations. Very good, because socialism is both private and social production. But the next month, they passed a law establishing a strong labor movement, because the previous labor movement was just a puppet in the hands of the Communist Party. So that beginning in August of 2005, the labor movement was being pushed. And then 1 month later, the government passed a law that every corporation had to sign and work out a union contract. Right. Now they have a problem because the corporation didn't want to do it. So the president of China, his name is Hu Jintao, he called the president of Walmart. Walmart has 65 stores all over China. China, the biggest. And they sat down and said, you've got to obey the law. We passed a law to protect you.
Okay.
Now you have to do what the law said
Right.
and protect the workers. They signed 62 contracts.
Okay.
What I'm telling you is, that's exactly what the protection of labor.
Well, exactly, and actually what you've described is a version of you know, what used to be called the social contract in America between government, business, and labor. But Mr. Frank here.
I had a question for
okay.
Tom over
for this
here.
Tom, okay.
Yeah, this Tom, yeah. So Tom, you, yeah, hey. When you're describing voluntary membership sort of for unions, so how is that different from what happens in right-to-work states right now? And that hasn't exactly been a great thing for labor.
Oh, I think that if labor, you're right, it is right to work. And what I am pushing is exactly what labor has resisted all along. I think there should be, labor ought to try right to work. Labor ought to try organizing and even expanding outside its base and just saying, look, if you don't like the job we're doing, don't pay us. And I don't think the world would end. I've heard over and over, oh, right to work is the worst thing that ever happens. I don't think it's the worst thing that's ever happened. Those unions have to deliver for their membership. In fact, I would make it easier for them to get out of a union altogether. What I think has to happen is that the incentives have to change so that you don't have labor being this involuntary taxing organization that takes people's money, whether they like it or not, with no accountability to them, because I can assure you, Kim, from my experience, there is no democracy in the labor movement, certainly at the kind of level that would lead to any change in leadership at the top. You haven't seen any change in leadership except when people die. It's like the Vatican. So there is the same situation in labor, and it goes right down to the lowest level. People don't have any control over their business agents. Fine, let's go to right to work. Let's make them earn the money.
But Tom, you know there's democracy in the labor movement. Come on, local unions all over America, they hold elections all the time.
They do, and we just finished a case where for the first time the U.S. attorney actually prosecuted one of these unions for ballot fraud, and 3 people were convicted. Since Landrum-Griffin has been passed, I found out, because I did a little research, there has been not one criminal prosecution for ballot fraud until 2008 in the city of Chicago, in Local 743 of the Teamsters, a prosecution which allowed a militant, progressive leadership to come in and take over that union, as Kim well knows, that is the best thing that has happened to the Teamsters in decades in the Chicago area. And that's exactly what democracy allows. But it's very hard to get the government in to supervise every one of those elections and to have a really open process. Failing that, voluntary membership at least holds them accountable to keeping people contributing. You know, if 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, and if out of 50 million Frenchmen, there is 20% paying union dues who are out there on the streets, and the other part of the French population supports them. They sort of wait to see what they can pull off, and if it looks like they're succeeding, they rise up too. That is, I think, a better model for labor in the long run, getting people in voluntarily. And of course, there's a lot of other things. It's not just voluntary membership. You've got to have institutions that workers can directly control so that they can feel part of the labor movement. That's why I like works councils so much, and lots of other things. So I say, go to right to work.
Okay, yes.
I don't need microphones. It's real quick. Has any of you been watching or paying attention to following what's going on in Puerto Rico, all the strikes? Like, you have?
A little. I know they're going on.
I mean, the governor of Virginia is definitely involved with like real estate, and he's been cutting jobs, like I think 20,000 people were laid off last month, and everybody is striking.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. 30,000. Yeah.
It's awesome.
I should get down there.
Yep.
That would be fun.
Yeah, there's a pretty aggressive labor movement in Puerto Rico, and they're fighting it, and God bless them, right? That's the right thing.
Perhaps because U.S. labor law doesn't entirely outlaw organizing there. Oh, sorry.
Follow up, sorry.
Yeah. No, I don't.
You know, but Puerto has also been using censorship, arresting people arbitrarily, and, you know, they need some kind of, like, protection. It doesn't seem that anyone on the mainland or on these
Yeah, and, right, and that points up another, you know, perhaps it's a different panel, but apart from Mr. Greenhouse, there are almost no reporters in American journalism who cover labor as a beat anymore, and that's a huge, huge shift. And there are lots of interesting institutional and political reasons for that, but as I say, probably another panel. Someone else? Yes, you. Hi. This time. Okay. Oh, okay. We won't make you choose Tom's.
I'm in a union. Okay. I'm in the teachers union here, and I'm actually experiencing what you're talking about with the rank and file and the disconnect. I believe it's called law of oligarchy that you're referring to. I think that's the term, you know, with the bureaucratic union. My question is, what could be done as far legally? Because we're not totally against the people in the union, right? You said kind of two things here. There's a problem. The people that are in the positions of power, 40 years or whatever it is, they're just handed down, next one in line. But we don't hate those people. They're pro-labor, right? So how do we make the switch? How do we get the voluntary? Are there laws? How
do you get more voice and more exit? The last thing that's on the agenda in the country right now is increasing union democracy. If you think they've cut back on wage hour enforcement at the Labor Department over the years, and they have absolutely decimated the provisions of the Landrum-Griffin Act relating to union democracy. And the only person who can file a suit really enforcing union democracy in elections to ensure that there's fair, open process is the Secretary of Labor, at least in private sector unions. So this is another area where even the legal process is closed off to rank and file people. If you lose an election or you feel you're being screwed during an election process in one way or another, or aren't getting your voice out there ain't nothing you can do about it except send in a protest to the Secretary of Labor in Washington, D.C., who will tell you, we don't have the staff. And will probably, except in rare cases on very technical things, not take any action at all. And when they do take action, they don't have the resources to prosecute the cases. So the cases end up drifting over into the next election cycle. And I think that with there are two answers. One is to condition, and I argued this, and which side are you on when I wrote it in 1991, condition any extension of the right to organize to a real union democracy process, change the Landrum-Griffin Act so that it's enforceable by rank and file people. And the second thing is to create other institutions where workers have some sort of sense of control, because I despair of kind of fiddling around with the existing labor law system now. I think we've got to move in new directions and and in particular, take a clue from the Europeans as to what they're doing and move towards works councils where workers directly control the process and it's not mediated through unions.
Well, I also want to add that it seems to me that there are some new unions happening in the country. They're just not defined as unions, right? We've got this very narrow definition of what a union is. And who says we have to abide by those laws, right? Why can't we, you know, the taxi drivers here in New York City are just awesome what they're doing, right? They're organizing, they're a union. They just can't fit into quite the weird labor laws that we've got in this country, but they're clearly a union, right? You got all these domestic worker folks organizing. They're clearly unions. Again, again, they can't fit into the narrow box we've got, but there's some interesting organizing going on. It just doesn't quite fit in the boxes. So I think it's a little more hopeful if you look outside the box.
Hello, how do you explain, where is the moral rights of every human being to be able to take care of their children, their families, their homes. What happened to the moral fiber? Do we need a moral revolt in the country? And the Constitution says we have the right to liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. And why is this not happening?
Wow.
Where do you instill this?
This
I
is
can
money.
see they're looking at me.
I know in life you have evil and you have good. It seems that evil is prospering, and I think the people got to stand. I'm a labor guy,
Well,
and I'm speaking up, and I've won a lot of issues because I know what I'm saying, and I'm able to speak up and speak up correctly. So I wish everybody could unite. Maybe we have a moral revolt in the country, but the people are very important to us. All of us.
if you look
we have
at
that
all-
human God-given right. Something's
right,
wrong.
right.
What are we run by the devil?
Right.
If you look at all of the religious teachings, all of them focus on core concepts of economic justice, right? You can't read, I memorized Bible verses as a kid. You can't read this stuff and not realize that, thou shalt not steal and care for your neighbor as yourself are pretty fundamental economic principles here. So the teachings are really strong. But what's happened in the, we've got this weird process that's happened in religious life in the U.S. As part of our sort of individuality kind of stuff, we've segmented religion and what it can speak to sex, and who you can have it with and all that kind of stuff, or not, and to family life, right? But we've limited what the religious community can speak to and not allowed it into the economic. I met one time with an owner who was very active in his church and was running a sweatshop, right? So, we went and said, could you explain to us how you kind of reconcile, running this sweatshop with your faith? And he said, well, I like to keep my faith out of business decisions. Well, there you have it, right? But again, I think the religious community has allowed that to happen, right? When we've not preached and taught on these core teachings and how they apply to economic life, we've surrendered to the right wing on this stuff. And, it is, for those of you who are engaged in the religious community, it is indeed one of the real struggles, right? How do we not have the Joel Osteens of the world sort of speaking completely for the religious community and lift up, in fact, what are sort of the core texts of all of our traditions, which is clear on economic justice. It's a fight within the religious community, frankly.
Tom F., you had a...
I was just going to say, there is, of course, a moral revolt underway in America. We all know about that. Right, all my friends back in Kansas, and they're they're up in arms, and they speak in a very workerist language. I was just mentioning earlier Sarah Palin and the Carhartts, but this is if you talk to even the people who are fighting the theory of evolution, they talk in this workerist language. They're outraged at the professionals. They're outraged at people like us, or people like the New School, I should say, and. This is, it's just all stood on its head. But there is a populist revolt out there in the land. It's just all going in the wrong direction. It's not funny. It's kind of awful, but it's out there. People are furious, and it's everything we're saying here stood on its head.
Andrew also had a quick. Oh, okay.
I got to put some hope in here, though.
Okay.
No.
That's my end of the table here. I just met with a guy who runs this association for Hispanic evangelical churches. There's 10,000 of them, and they're trying to figure out, they're on the front lines on immigration reform, and they want to get more involved in worker justice issues around the country, right? They've got 10,000 congregations around the nation. So I think there's a lot more hope here that we can see more engagement on these issues than perhaps you do.
You think? So, Andrew, what was your...
Yeah, I think another angle or another way of approaching this is really to ask whether capitalism can be moral. And I know this is an old debate, but it's picked up a lot of steam recently or been revived for two reasons. One, because of the corporate social responsibility movement, and secondly, because of the claims made in behalf of green or natural capitalism and capitalist sustainability. The corporate social responsibility movement is still little understood, I think, although it's certainly massive. I had a student recently who applied for a job at Eileen Fisher, which was a job title of Human Rights Associate, and it was part of the social consciousness division of Eileen Fisher. And this is just amazing, mind-boggling.
That is hard to
corporation could create this.
How big is that division?
Huh?
No.
It's a very important part of every major corporate organization to have divisions like this. But the other part is the sustainability part, and I'm here to beat my green drum tonight. I want to go back to the question you asked about, if employers are only driven by profit earnings in the next quarterly statement. I mean, some part of the answer to that question lay with the shareholder revolution. That's the origin of that whole culture. But it does raise the bigger question about growth and whether capitalism is capable not just of sustaining itself, which is in doubt, has always been in doubt, but ever more so now, and also whether it's capable of producing products, operations, practices that are sustainable for the rest of the world. And there is a big debate right now about green capitalism, whether that is something that can actually go forward, whether, in other words, the market solution rather than the market failure that Tom evoked, whether there are market solutions to the crisis of sustainability. And it seems to me that is a conversation, and I'm just really underlining what I said earlier, that's a conversation that labor really has to be part of at this point. It's a very important voice in that conversation, and ultimately it has to do with whether you can have capitalism without growth. I mean, that's one of the scenarios. There are people who believe that's impossible. Unless capitalism grows, then it dies. But the folks who are proponents of green capitalism and natural capitalism, Paul Hawken and that whole crowd, do believe that if you take growth out of the picture, if you have a steady state economy, if you have a closed loop material economy, profits can still be made, decent wages can still be earned. You just won't necessarily have the kind of growth that is clearly destructive to land and life. And I'm not necessarily a proponent of that. I'm just putting it out there and alerting you to that debate if you don't know about it, because it seems very relevant, and again, it's something labor should definitely be part of.
Anyone else? Way in back there. And the microphone is coming.
Hi. I've worked in the labor movement for the past 8 years as an organizer. And I've been exploring different kinds of models of organizing. And a model I've become increasingly interested in is the model of associational unionism, where by any worker in specifically industry-focused associational unionism, whereby any worker within an industry can join that union, even if their workplace doesn't have a contract. Specifically, I think about the statistics by Kate Bronfenbrenner, where 51% of the campaigns lose, then another 50% don't ever get a contract. And in my mind, that's a lot of organized workers without a union contract. Excuse me. So I just wanted to, I guess, put that out there and ask, what is the panel's thoughts on this model and its potential?
It sounds like it has affinities. Oh, you want to go first?
Yeah, no, Tom, that sounds like you.
It does sound like me, and in fact, it was me.
The culprit is identified.
Pushed this. In The Nation in 2002, I co-wrote an article with somebody who's a much better writer than I am, Barbara Ehrenreich, where we talked about this associational union membership. And, to my jaw-dropping astonishment, I got a call, we both got a call from Lynn Williams, who was the former president of the Steelworkers, And he really tried to push this in the Steelworkers Union to get it going. And there was mild interest in it. They were polite. I like the Steelworkers. They're nice. They're full of Canadians who are, really very attuned to the problems of declining union membership in a way the Americans aren't. But they didn't put the resources into it. I think had Lynn still been the president of the union, he would have really tried to make a go of starting a whole different model of union membership. But it didn't happen. I think it could. And what I thought we should do is, even though this sounds like a lawyer's organization, but really set up a clearinghouse and let people take advantage and provide consultation and even representation of a whole series of labor law provisions that people could use even to get their wages increased, and to make life difficult for the employer and so on and so forth, which I don't think labor does enough because they've got a particular model. It's to kind of get the corporate campaign out to people directly, to allow them to fiddle around and try it for themselves with the idea that they're financing it through their own membership. But you've got to get a critical base. You've got to get some unions behind it. It takes a lot of work.
But indeed, that's what some of these sector-based worker center movements are really doing.
Yeah, that's right.
It's exactly what they're doing.
That is right.
Again, it's just I think it is really another form of unions in the nation right now. And to the AFL-CIO's credit, they've recognized this and affiliated a lot of them with central labor councils. And I think that's a very good move.
Yep.
Back there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I just want to sort of bring it a little bit closer to home. I mean, personally, I'm from Michigan, so I've seen all of the Rust Belt stuff. And for many years, I taught at FIT, which is the most unionized school, or
Really?
secondary school in the city. Oh. But in terms of culture workers, I mean, I've written for Artforum, I think I have a review in this Bookforum, but culture workers are sort of treated in a completely different way, so that everything that you're discussing in some ways doesn't apply. I mean, there are things like the Authors Guild and Freelancers Union, but it's kind of come to a point where you end up having a very highly developed, very unmarketable skill. And I'm just curious if you have anything you want to say about that, because it's almost the discussion, whether it's coal miners, whether it's any of that. If you're a writer in New York, obviously the exact same things apply with no other, and I think we all know, like in the case of many publications, the idea is simply that you're lucky to be published, which is the same rhetoric as, sort of turn of the century.
Right, you're lucky to have a job.
Exactly, otherwise there's another immigrant behind you. Right. So I'm just curious if you want to address that.
I believe Mr. Frank would like to address that.
Yeah, well, I think about this all the time. I mean, I guess I'm fairly successful as culture workers go, and I'm happy about that, and I'm extremely lucky. And I suppose I would be thankful every day if I was that kind of person. But instead, I just swill the booze and eat the red meat and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, we can all see what's happening to the industry that I work in. It is falling apart. I mean, look at the news. Both of the newspapers in Chicago are in bankruptcy. The Chicago Reader, the sort of the weekly paper there, also. My hometown in Kansas City, I had a dinner with some guys from the Kansas City Star, and just the stories they were telling me about what's happened there. And this is, a medium-sized city. The newsroom has just been decimated. They can't cover anything anymore. They don't have book reviews. Their main columnist, the guy, their one columnist that everybody in the city likes to read, he's part-time now. This is happening everywhere. This industry is in a state of collapse, and what you just said is what is coming to pass. That 10 years from now it'll be you're working for free, or maybe you'll pay me.
Yeah, just ask.
You'll pay me to publish your article.
That's Chris Anderson's model from Wired.
Oh, excellent. They are beyond shame. Wired, they're beyond the call of bankruptcy. I can't understand how they keep going. Well, of course I understand. We always understand how libertarians keep going, right? They're subsidized, of course. But let me end by saying this. We have a new issue of the Baffler magazine coming out. While the rest of the world collapses, we somehow revive ourselves. And we have an excellent essay on exactly this subject, and I'm very proud of it. I didn't write it, of course. I'm not, smart enough, but it's a beautiful essay, and you'll see.
Yes, Andrew, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up, but you get the last word.
I would just say it's very easy to forget, the degree to which cultural workers were heavily unionized, and still are in certain sectors in the course of the 20th century. I mean, musicians, journalists, the entertainment industries, actors, and so on and so forth. These are real union strongholds. It's only in the last 20 years or so when the free agent, the freelance cultural worker, the creative, has been highlighted as a kind of model worker of the neoliberal era for all sorts of reasons, because of the particular work mentality that is highly sacrificial, that will sacrifice almost anything for the pursuit of the gratifying aesthetic finish. That's been a very useful model and has been touted as a universally applicable model for all high wage workers who are sort of off the tenure track, as it were. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. But one of the big patterns here, and it's the end of the show, I know, and we don't have time to get into it, is about the transfer of work outside of the labor process and onto users and consumers and what the industry calls prosumers. And a lot of that is happening through digitization. The sheer volume of work that's getting transferred out of regular jobs, what we would classify and recognize as regular jobs, and into the social factory at large. A lot of it happening on the social web, increasingly. A lot of it happening, I mean, the most visible, I guess, and Tom just evoked this, that, the shift of work outside of print journalism and onto the web is just astonishing. I mean, there's nowhere near like the amount of jobs that are being created in the digital industries that match those that are being lost in their counterpart industries. Although the work is, you can trace the work as it gets transferred. That's a huge shift. It's something we haven't talked about this evening, but it's a massive social shift, that transfer of work.
Yes, and another panel, another time. But thank you all so much. It's been a very engaging night. I appreciate you all coming out. Oh, and buy books over there and keep these culture workers employed.
Show some solidarity, folks.
Yes.
Come on.